Our closing speaker at the We the Women Global Town Hall is one of the world's most influential economists and public intellectuals, and she is also one of the most inspirational women anywhere in the world. Dr. Gita Gopinath made history when she was appointed to the post of first Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. The IMF of today, of course, is in a critical role. The world is watching how it will respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Dr. Gopinath will be talking about that, the impact of the global economy, the impact of the pandemic on women, but also about her own extraordinary personal journey. It is my pleasure and my privilege to welcome Gita Gopinath to be our closing speaker in this grand finale moment of this day-long global town hall at We the Women. Thank you, Dr. Gopinath, for making the time. I know how crazy busy your calendar is, so really appreciate it. Now, let me start straight off by asking you, we're in the middle of a war and the global economy is taking a double hit. It was barely kind of emerging from the shadows of a 2-year-long pandemic. The IMF had downcast its forecast for the global economy, and now we're in the middle of a war. How worried are you? How concerned are you? What is your appraisal of how badly this is going to hit the world in terms of the economic consequences?
Firstly, Barkha, let me tell you, it's such a pleasure to join you. And when you talk about inspiring women, I think you take the cake. So you really are up there at the very top. We were in Delhi University together at the same time. And so, you know, I followed your career and it's truly inspiring.
Thank you so much.
In terms of your question, you know, without a doubt, this is going to have serious economic consequences. There is a terrible war in Ukraine, and of course, you know, our hearts go out to people who have been affected by this. It's just tragic. And then we also have the economic sanctions that have been imposed. I think that combination has very serious consequences. Now, in terms of, if I were to kind of highlight what are the big features, I would first say is the, you know, besides the human toll, is the fact that we are seeing commodity prices just go through the roof again. And that is one of the biggest dangers to the recovery in the global economy, which is we're seeing prices of oil and natural gas and food, including wheat and corn, where, you know, Ukraine and Russia are some of the biggest exporters. And we're seeing that going up, which has a huge negative effect on the global recovery, but also, you know, just not, you know, recognizing that it's the poor and the low-income households that get most affected when such prices go up. The second big disruption is coming, of course, to countries that have very close trade links with Russia and Ukraine, and so mostly countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. We're seeing, you know, we would expect to see bigger hits over there. The third piece is on just in terms of financial markets. We have had extraordinary sanctions that we've never seen before being implemented. As of now, we're seeing turmoil in financial markets to differential extent, but, you know, we haven't seen the full story yet. I think people are still absorbing what the sanctions are going to do. And then we have the aspects of cyber risk. You know, there are many other unintended consequences that are playing out at this point. And we have our World Economic Outlook that we will be updating numbers for in April. So that's when we will be able to give a very fuller picture, including in terms of quantitative estimates.
Gita, the SDR of the IMF, the special drawing rights, are now in global focus. American legislators, for example, want the IMF reserves of Russia to be frozen. There is concern that Russia could turn to China to access cash that will effectively be used to continue to wage this war against Ukraine. Have you and the sort of leadership at the IMF applied any thought to how you might handle Russia's reserves at the IMF?
So, Barkha, we allocated these additional reserves of about $650 billion last year to help countries recover from the pandemic so that they have the reserves to be able to handle the kinds of ongoing shocks that countries are facing. Now, then there is the question of how countries use those reserves, and that is not something that we get into. The way it typically works is that if a country wants to use its reserves, it gets into voluntary exchanges with other member countries to convert those SDRs in what we call freely usable currencies, which is basically dollars and euros and so on. Now, typically that's a voluntary exchange. And, what we're seeing right now is that that's just gotten a whole lot more difficult at this point for Russia to do.
Does that effectively mean that the IMF has no control on how these reserves might be used? If Russia were to turn to China, because several other countries have blocked that usage, the IMF would then not be able to get involved in how that money is used?
So again, Barkha, we have to go strictly by the articles that control what we can and cannot do. And again, like I said, we've allocated the SDRs, but in terms of how countries exchange it, that is for the countries to decide. And our articles do not allow you to exclude countries just based on because of sanctions that have been imposed at this time. But again, I would just say that this is a fast-changing scenario, and so things can change over time. But this is where we are right now.
What would be your prescription, if any, and what would be the warnings that you would want to sound to the sort of world stage at large, given that there is a very unpredictable situation? This could be a long war, a long conflict, and you've already outlined the multiple ways in which the global economy could take a hit. But are there any prescriptive thoughts or any sort of health warnings at this point that you think governments across the world should be paying heed to?
Of course, first and foremost, countries will have to determine how it is affecting their own economies. If you are a major importer of commodities, be it food or be it oil and natural gas, that immediately has an impact on your budget in terms of the amount of how costly it's going to be for you. It has implications for inflation, and we are in a time when we have inflation at very high levels in many parts of the world where we hadn't seen it before, like including the US, where inflation is over 7%, headline inflation. Similarly, in Europe, inflation is very high. So we've had previous episodes when commodity prices have shot up, but usually inflation at that time has been in the 2 and 3% range. So this is an unusual challenge that monetary policymakers are facing. They're going to have to weigh the trade-offs of raising interest rates to deal with inflation that is underlying their economies, while at the same time you're getting a big hit to inflation coming from these higher increases in prices. So I think that's one piece that has to be figured out, and something that we're working on too. The second, of course, is countries will have to figure out how to deal with the hit to livelihoods when you have very big increases in these prices. The third is in terms of financial institutions, making sure that any overreaction in markets is dealt with appropriately. I think there are many dimensions to this, and in general, you're functioning with very high levels of uncertainty. So, constant surveillance is necessary.
You're speaking to us after making history, being appointed to your post as the first deputy managing director of the IMF. In peacetime, I might have asked you what are the priorities that you would like to focus on, but I think between the pandemic and this conflict, those priorities perhaps have written themselves out for you.
True, Barkha. I mean, if you, I think it was March 2020 when the WHO declared there was a global pandemic, and 2 years later, February 2022, we have a war in Ukraine. So, there is no lack of disruptions, major disruptions to the world that we're seeing. So, the three big buckets that the IMF deals with is one, the surveillance, which is, figuring out how the global landscape is changing, but also in terms of what policies are needed. The second is in terms of our lending. And the third is what we call capacity development, which is helping countries build the institutions they need to deal with the macroeconomy. And all three of these there's a huge demand for all of this coming from what the developments of the last couple of years. And so, firstly, I think we have to continue to be able to look at 190 countries that we follow, assess what the spillovers are going to be, what the implications are going to be for the global economy. That comes out in the World Economic Outlook. That's a very important part of what's needed. And then in terms of what policies will work best in these unusual times. I mean, usually, economic policy is not designed for a pandemic and it's not designed for a war. So these are very unusual situations in which to give advice. Then in terms of lending, I mean, we have countries that will have a very hard time handling these ongoing shocks. And again, how best we can help our member countries is very important, and similarly on capacity development. In terms of one broad area, Barkha, coming out of this pandemic.
I can't hear her.
Oh.
You're back. Go ahead. Sorry, just complete that last thought.
One of the very salient trends that we have focused on at this point is the big increase in debt across all countries coming out of the pandemic. Just in terms of dealing with the pandemic required spending, and that has ended up with many countries with high levels of debt. And so we've had, just in terms of numbers, we have 60% of low-income countries that are already either in debt distress or high risk of debt distress. About 5 to 6 years ago, that number was more like 30%. So in terms of how we think about debt relief, that's another big area that we're working on, but also in terms of how to prevent more widespread debt crisis and defaults in the future. So again, that's another big area. And then lastly, we're living in times where countries will use multiple tools. It's not just about kind of plain vanilla monetary policy, but in terms of exchange rate interventions, in terms of capital controls, many other kinds of measures. And one of the areas that we've been working a lot on is how to tailor the advice to country-specific circumstances when they have to use this whole swath of instruments.
I want to come to the impact of pandemic, in particularly on women in just a moment. But if you had to use like an adjective to describe your appraisal of where the world stands right now and where the global economy stands right now, what would that be? Would it be anxious? Would it be, grim? Would it be something else, something more dire?
I would say that it is highly differentiated. So for me, the picture that strikes is if I look at the recoveries that I'm seeing in advanced economies, much stronger recoveries back to pre-pandemic trend, while many emerging and developing economies are seeing what we call scarring, which is they're quite far from where they would have been in the absence of the pandemic. So that, to me, is the most striking picture in terms of what we're seeing in this recovery.
Okay, thank you for that. And I know the world will be sort of waiting for these comments that we've just heard from you. Let me step back and look at the pandemic, in particular the impact on women who have been in so many ways invisibilized by what COVID has done and ravaged our not just economy, but our social structures. One report suggested that 800 billion, women globally lost 800 billion in income in 1 year. In just 2020, 64 million jobs were lost worldwide. In India here, we are seeing a sharp decline in the number of women working. In any case, the female labor force participation had been coming down. The irony, of course, is that, we've got women at the front line. 70% of the healthcare workforce is made up by women. Gita, have you had some time to apply your mind to this, to what this means for women who aren't even being spoken of?
No, this is something that we do pay close attention to. So when we looked during the peak of the pandemic, without a doubt, across the board, countries were much more harder hit. And you saw that because they tended to be working in contact-intensive sectors, like in hospitality. Those sectors were hardest hit. That's what happened. Secondly, women tend to be much more involved in informal work that was hit much harder this time around than in previous recessions. So they were again, more deeply affected by it. And women continue to be the most major caregivers, be it children or elderly parents or people who are sick. It's women who stay home and do the caring. And because of that, because schools have stayed closed for such a long period of time in many countries, it's the woman who stays home and does the work. So we saw that happen in terms of the peak effect. We saw that across the board, women were hit hard. But when you look at the recovery, I think the recovery tells you that the policies do matter. for whether you're able to bring back women or not into the workplace. So for the advanced economy group as a whole, we've seen now, if you look at the hit in terms of employment, there's not much of a difference between men and women. But if you look at many emerging and developing economies, you still see that women are being held back. And even in India, like you said, I mean, to start with, labor force participation of women in India is just much lower than men, even by comparing to other countries. And then they got hit very hard, and we're seeing recoveries, but we're seeing slower recoveries for women coming back into the workforce. But again, policies do make a difference. Policies that help women manage work and home, keep schools open, help bring women back into the workforce, policies that provide income support to the most vulnerable women, we find has also been very welfare improving. And then there have been policies which have prevented matches from being broken, which is kind of preserving employment matches. And some countries have done that, and that has also helped.
Well, I really do hope that this gets more of the world's attention. Now, I know we're on limited time and there's huge amounts of interest in your own extraordinary journey, Dr. Gita Gopinath. And while we've all been warned that you're an extremely private person, I know that many women around the world could draw energy and inspiration from you. Now, it's been well documented that you have reached this extraordinary post, but you started as in a regular middle-class Indian home. And I read an interview with your dad where he jokingly spoke about not just how you were a poor performer at school, scoring 45%, he said, up to a certain point in school, but also that he had to place vegetables on the family table, on the dining table, to actually make you understand math. How did that girl become this economist?
I know. I've been talking to my father about that particular number, asking where he got that from. But it is true. The vegetable story is true. I think when we were very young, my father was teaching us math using vegetables. In terms of getting to this point, I think firstly, going after something you truly enjoy doing makes the experience great. So I would not put it as, fighting obstacles or, struggling to get here. I've enjoyed every bit of the work that I've done, be it as a professor of economics at Harvard, as chief economist at the IMF. It's just once you know this, and I think, Barkha, you can probably associate. Once you have, you love something if you find something that you love doing, then you can face all the adversaries along the way. So I think it's. I was very fortunate in terms of having the education that I did receive as a young girl. And I'm incredibly fortunate that I have a family and I have a husband who's incredibly supportive of everything I do. I mean, not just supportive, but just takes true, genuine pleasure in anything I achieve. So, that is hugely important. And so, having that social support, having great mentors, and, I'm a workaholic and I love what I do, and being driven, I think, is probably what got me here.
Yeah, I relate to that. I mean, I think we're lucky that we're able to do, what we love doing, and that we have people in our lives that actually take pleasure and encourage us to do that. But, you had a tweet which said that women are called hardworking and men are described as brilliant for actually the same performance. And that is so true, and that stayed with me. But what happens when a woman is both hardworking and brilliant, like yourself? You just described yourself as a workaholic. Do you find that the public scrutiny on yourself or on other women is sometimes mean, is sometimes cruel, is sometimes lopsided? Hillary Clinton, I was once interviewing her, and she said, women who are successful and have a mind of their own, they have to grow a hide as thick as the hide of a rhinoceros. Have you had to do that?
I think you have to do that. It also helps if you're a bit absent-minded, which I am. And so I don't. So, I don't pick up on all the cues around me. So, yes, I absolutely, I think it helps to be tougher skinned. I mean, there's also research on this, which is, for instance, there was a study done on women, comparing women doctors and male doctors, and finding that when a woman doctor makes a mistake, she has a huge drop in the number of patients who want to see her. But when a man makes a mistake, yeah, you give the person the benefit of the doubt. The person gets a second chance and a third chance. So I think it's absolutely right that as a woman, you probably get fewer second and third chances, which means, you have to be extra prepared and you have to make sure that things don't go wrong. That's so there are a bunch of these other things. Secondly, I do think that that women get saddled with the less exciting work, the kind of the mundane work in terms of in the office. And that's something I'm very cognizant about. And as a manager, I try to make sure that, hey, no, I know the women are nice and they want to step up and help, but hey, everybody should do the job, including men. So I do think you faced it. I mean, Barkha, when I was a chief economist, I went to a country and, the protocol is that you sit in front of the person, whatever, at the same rank. And so that was the central bank governor, and I was sitting opposite the central bank governor, and the deputy central bank governor comes in and looks at me and says, I think you're in the wrong chair, right? It's just assumption is that because there's only been male chief economists at the IMF, the assumption that there would be a woman was like, whoa, that doesn't happen. And so, that happens. That happens. But I find it funny at times. But again, I think it goes back to the point that, everything we said earlier, which is if you love what you're doing and you have the right people around you to support you, then you can deal with all of this.
Indra Nooyi famously and contentiously said women cannot have it all. She suggested a kind of inherent biological determinism to our lives, and I respectfully do not agree with her. I actually wanted to ask you why we are under pressure to have it all, this idea of the superwoman. Indian advertisements, since you're my contemporary from DU, Delhi University, you'd remember there's like this perfectly turned out woman who's sitting in a boardroom. She's perfectly able to do her children's homework remotely, also say what should be cooked for dinner, also manage the markets, also manage HR. Nobody is like that. We're not robots. So do you think that it's kind of a chain of gold for us to believe that we can be these superwomen? Is that the myth that needs to be busted?
So firstly, who decides what does it mean to have it all, right? What the hell is what all? I'm sorry. I think that's a very personal choice, what it means to have it all. If you're somebody for whom your work gives you all the happiness that you need, that is all. That is the all for you. So I think every woman should have the right to decide what does it mean to have it all. And that doesn't mean, like you said, doing everything that you just described. Because if you're put in a situation like that, you could become completely miserable. And it's important to be content and satisfied and happy, not just for yourself, but for everybody around you. So I think it's very important for you to decide what it means to have it all. And having it all could be one thing or could be three things, and you decide that. I've always been opposed to norms that people impose around, and this is what a woman does, and this is what a girl is expected to do. I think my family will tell you about how rebellious I've been about that. But again, that's what I completely agree with you, that the idea that women, by having it all, means this particular slate of things is just crazy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Now, I know we have limited time. I'm going to sneak in a couple of audience questions from our network of women who are watching this. One of them wants to know what is sort of, the behavioral trait in yourself that took you from Mysore to Lady Shri Ram College to Delhi University to Princeton to Harvard and now the IMF. Is there like a magic formula?
I don't think so. I don't think at any point in the way I was thinking, oh wow, I'm doing this and now I'm going to do that and I'm going to get there. Again, like I said, I've enjoyed whatever I was doing, wherever I was doing it at every point in time. I am somebody who, I think I don't know how to say this, but I'm somebody who's not very cognizant of hierarchy and so on. So it's not like I for instance, when I grew up spent most of my growing years in Mysore, and Mysore has a pretty, it's kind of a nice, simple town. And then I came to Delhi, And then I kept hearing the word Hesiod all the time, which is a word that I've never heard before. And, that is like, I just cannot stand for when people go around throwing around their Hesiod and doing this and that. And so I think it's important to believe in yourself, to enjoy what you're doing, and, demand the respect that you deserve in the world.
Have you had to demand respect? I'm just picking up that last sentence. What's like the most sexist experience you've had, or the toughest obstacle or the hoop that you've had to jump through that you actually had to unlearn or learn or prepare for in a way that when you were young, you never thought you'd have to fight?
That is a good question. I think along the way, you will always find yourself in a situation where people underestimate you for what you're saying, for what you do, because of the way you look, because of some implicit bias that they have. And the only person who can fight back against that is you. So you have to stand your ground. And if you have the skills and you've done your work, I found that time and time again that you're able to push back and get the respect that you deserve.
We have time just for one more audience question, and that is, again, on a subject close to your heart. How do we get more women in the workforce? You've spoken about it a little bit in this conversation, but the McKinsey report actually talks about, the McKinsey parity report actually talks about more women in the workforce being $1 trillion opportunity. This isn't altruism. This isn't just philosophical. This is actually something that will strengthen the economy, grow the economy. What would you prescribe companies to do, countries to do, to get more women working?
For a fact, we know that getting more women in the workforce, giving them the pay that they deserve, all of that has very positive effects, not just from a society's perspective, which is very important, but also from just a pure economic perspective. I mean, the benefits of that is huge. So I think that's it has to be well recognized at the country leadership level. It has to be well recognized at every single corporate level and institution at the very senior levels. What we find that works is, we've done this, for instance, at the IMF, is setting quantitative targets, which is not just saying that, yes, we have to do better, but actually saying, here's a target that we should be working towards. It comes from the leadership of the institution, and we have to get to much higher levels of representation of women in all of the different positions. So for right now, I'm very happy to say that if you look at the top membership management at the IMF, there are 5 people there, of which there are 3 that are women and 2 that are men. This has never happened before. This is not typically the case, but that's also true if you go down. We've set targets for how many women should be in leadership positions. So I think it's very important to do that, and that's what helps get women up the ladder. But of course, to make sure that we have a very big effect in terms of how women enter the workforce, you need to do a lot more ground up, which is, firstly, we need to address that they give women access to opportunities, be it on the health front, be it on education, be it in finance. There's a tremendous amount of work that's been done on it, and on the importance of providing these opportunities to women. It's also very important to make sure that there is a safe environment for women, in the sense that women can go out and go around and travel to different places and get to work where they have to get to work without having to be worried about physical safety. I think that's very important. So that's another area that has to be addressed.
Which brings me to my closing question. You grew up in India, as we all know. What is the one thing that you did not have access to or an opportunity for as a young girl in India that you would really passionately, desperately want for every Indian girl, and why only Indian girl, every young girl to have everywhere?
What comes immediately to mind for me is what I said right the last point I made, which is feeling safe about being able to go around and not having been reminded a gazillion times about all the risks that are out there, even at 6 p.m. in the evening, and the areas that, things that you can and cannot do because you're a girl, just from a physical safety point of view. And that's something that I remember. I remember traveling on DTC buses in Delhi, and very often getting off the bus before I got to my destination because it was unbearable to be in the bus. And that is like the memory that sticks to me. And unfortunately, when I read the news, there have been some improvements, but there's a whole lot big distance to travel there, right? So just that sense of feeling secure, physically safe, so that I can go on to do what I want to do and realize my potential. I think that's one thing I would hope for all girls.
Well, I think that's a memory that many of our vintage do share from public transport in our college and school-going years. And even today, professional women speak about it all the time. Thank you, Dr. Gita Gopinath. I could go on forever. I have 100 more questions, but I know you don't even have a minute more. It has been a pleasure to have you, I think, fittingly be our closing speaker and bring the curtains down on this We the Women Global Town Hall. We hope to meet you in India and have a lot more India-specific questions for you as well. But for now, we let you go and get back to saving the world and the global economy that sure does need saving. Thank you, Gita. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Barkha. As I said in the beginning, it's a real honor to speak to you.